button. All right, well, thank you for joining us this evening for our fourth Thursday deep dive. It is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight. I would like to welcome Dr. Thomas Stevens. He is currently a postdoctorate associate with the University of Minnesota. He is studying the impacts of controlled burns on bird communities. He completed his PhD in 2022 at TCU and was co-advised by Dr. Amanda Hill and Dr. Dean Williams. He is presenting tonight his research investigating the impacts of urbanization on wildlife in our Great Trinity Forest. Welcome.
All right, thank you. So opening shot here is the Great Trinity Forest. This was my field location for a lot of research I did, 2018 to 2022. If you ever went out to the Great Trinity Forest and went on the AT&T Trail or the Buckeye Trail, there's a chance that you saw me because I was out there a lot, early in the mornings, all seasons. You definitely would have recognized me. I would have been like the 6'5" person, like covered in electronics to like a comical degree, like carrying a big directional microphone and a clipboard with headphones around my neck and a GPS and a stopwatch around my neck, and just looking pretty ridiculous overall, marching around in the middle of nowhere in the forest. So a lot of funny interactions with people when they would see me and just be totally puzzled trying to figure out what I was doing out there. So I'll get into my presentation. I'm going to start off with a little background about urbanization and how it impacts wildlife and wildlife habitats, as just kind of a conceptual introduction to the research I did and kind of why I was investigating the questions that I was. All right, so biodiversity loss has rapidly accelerated. We are in the 5th mass extinction. One of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss is habitat loss. There's a variety of things that are driving habitat loss, and one of them is urbanization. So this is a map. There's color-coded dots representing cities of different sizes. This initial image is from 1950. And when we jump forward, there's a couple things I want you to notice, just how many more large cities there are, and also the percentage of people living in cities. So right here, you can see that in 1950, 70% of the global population was rural. So 30% of people were living in urban areas. So we jump to 2015, not only is obviously the population grown significantly, but a much higher percentage of people are living in urban areas as well. So now over half the global population lives in urban areas, where before it was 30%. And all these trends are predicted to continue. Global population is going to continue to grow, although that growth is slowing. But the trends of increasing urbanization of the global population are continuing. There's an issue that lots of people are trying to figure out: how can urbanization and biodiversity coexist, especially because a lot of these large cities you can see here are located in areas of high biodiversity and high endemicism. So urbanization can impact habitats in a couple of ways. So here we have two images, the same location in different times. So between 1984 and 2016, this area significantly urbanized. So you have areas like this one that was once part of a forest bordering an urban area. That habitat is now completely changed to an urban zone. When habitats urbanize, that's one of the most, or it is the most significant or impactful type of habitat change. So if you compare urbanization to agriculture or other human activities for the land, urbanization is the most severe change from a natural habitat to what it becomes. So not only does urbanization like directly change areas, it also fragments them. So if you notice this location, if you were standing in the forest in the center of this blue circle, it would seem relatively similar in terms of the trees are there, haven't been cut down. There's not houses there now. But in 1984, this patch of habitat had some connectivity to other habitat downriver, and now it is isolated on all sides by urbanization. So this actual piece of habitat hasn't changed, but the matrix around it has. I'm going to use that term matrix quite a bit because that's what a lot of my research is about. So how does it impact habitat to be bordered by an urban area? So urbanization impacts wildlife And there are kind of three general responses that wildlife can be grouped into in terms of how they react when habitat urbanizes. We'll use birds here for an example. So there are urban exploiters. So these are species that actually become more common when habitat urbanizes. They're more common in urban areas than they are in natural habitats. A lot of these species are globally ubiquitous. You can find house sparrows, starlings, rock pigeons in cities all over the world. So those are urban exploiters. We also have urban adapters. So these are species that you can find in natural habitats and in urban areas. These will be different species in different areas. Here in Texas, good examples would be a cardinal, a blue jay, things like that. Then we have urban avoiders. This is a relatively large group of species that when habitat urbanizes, they cannot cope with the really significant changes to their environment, and they are not found in urban areas. So not only are these species impacted, again, when their habitat directly changes, but their presence can be impacted just by what happens in the matrix. So on the left side, we have a number of forest fragments surrounded by agricultural landscape. In these scenarios, if we use those same examples of birds from before, these forest fragments can still contain urban avoiding species if they are of large enough size. There are edge effects that people have studied quite a lot. But if you have a forest fragment of similar composition, of similar tree age, of similar size, people have found that you will lose those urban avoiding birds just if the matrix around it changes. So there's some interesting studies where in the Midwest United States, some researchers at Ohio State looked at these riparian forest fragments that started out in rural areas. And as the river moved into an urban center, the actual width of the riparian forest fragment around this river would stay the same. The composition of tree species would stay the same, but a significant number of species were lost just as the surrounding matrix transitioned from an agricultural one to an urban one. So there's a variety of implications for this. There's a variety of different hypothesized drivers. So what is causing these impacts? Is it because the species can't move through urban areas where they could agricultural areas? Is it because of the noise produced by urban areas? Because of light pollution, invasive species? So there's a variety of different hypotheses for what is creating this. When we look at urban avoiding species, people have done some studies and found that species vulnerable to land use change are the same species that are vulnerable to climate change. So when we talk about urban avoiding species, we're really talking about kind of this group of wildlife that is suffering the most from all the human impacts on the environment as a total. So in general, these are the species that people are interested in conserving. And when people look at groups of wildlife, birds is an example that people work with often, people have defined or tried to define or tried to understand or relate traits to which species can cope with urbanization and those that can't. And the biggest trait in the most general sense is specialization. So species that have highly specialized habitats or diets, that specialization can take place in a number of parts of their life history. Those are the species that can't cope with urbanization and climate change and a lot of these other impacts humans are having on the environment. So the big picture research question I had when I got to TCU to work on my dissertation is I wanted to try to understand how we might be able to conserve these sensitive species in urban forest fragments. This is really important for a variety of reasons. There's just the straight biodiversity conservation regions that I alluded to earlier when I talked about how there's this this collision of these large megacities and super biodiverse areas with lots of endemic species, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, places in Southeast Asia, et cetera. So just conceptually, this is an important thing to understand. Another really important thing is lots of times people living in dense urban areas don't have access to wild outdoor areas. They don't have access to this type of wildlife and these types of experiences. So there's a lot of research on the impact of being outdoors in wild spaces that it has on people. So the idea of preserving more fragments of habitat in these expanding urban areas is something that urban planners are interested in. But how do we maintain species of conservation interest when this happens? So I wanted to explore these research questions in the Great Trinity Forest. So the existence of the Great Trinity Forest was kind of what prompted my research in that direction. I was looking for really good field locations to do interesting research here in DFW that I could commute to easily. So I did my PhD later in life. I already had 3 kids. Traveling to some far off field location, being gone whole months of the summer wasn't a good option, which is what some other researchers or PhD students do when they have a natural history project. So the Great Trinity Forest is in southeast Dallas. So you can see in the little insert there, it takes up a pretty large area of the city. Kind of that whole southeast quarter of the city is kind of dominated by the Great Trinity Forest. It's kind of wound in around it. It's over 4,000 hectares. So this is by far the largest urban forest in the United States. You think about other urban forests, you think about Central Park, that's 500 hectares. This is much, much bigger. There was no official statistic for this, but I did some investigating on my own because when I included this little sentence in my research paper about it being the largest urban forest, I actually looked pretty extensively for anything else I could find. And this was the biggest one in the United States. It's a bottomland hardwood forest. So that basically means it's a forested wetland. So the reason why the Great Trinity Forest exists, the reason why it is not being developed at this point is because it is underwater multiple times every year. So all this forested area you see in this aerial image gets flooded yearly. And that's basically the only thing limiting this area being developed. It's not formally protected in any way. There's different fragments of the forest that different city departments kind of have ownership of or are quote unquote running. But there's not really a whole lot of management happening there. There's some different people that are working kind of on the nonprofit side of things. And there are some people who work at the city who are trying to kind of get a handle on what's going on there, but there's no large scale management or protection happening here. The forest occurs along a gradient of urbanization. So when we move to the top left part of this image, which would be kind of the northwest extent of the forest, you can see that the matrix around this part of the forest is more densely urbanized. So the houses are closer together. There's large areas of impervious surface where we have industrial buildings. And as we move to the southeast, the matrix around the Great Trinity Forest becomes less intensely urbanized. The neighborhoods have more large trees, there's more rural areas. So it's surrounded by an urban matrix on all sides, but that urban matrix is not uniformly urban in its intensity. The Great Trinity Forest is very diverse in its habitat types. I'm sure some of you have spent some time there, and you'll know that there are areas of early successional habitat where there was former illegal dumping grounds that have been restored to a degree, and you have like quasi grassland savanna habitats. You also have some areas in the forest where you have legitimate old growth forest with huge old bur oaks and cedar elms that dominate the canopy. And you kind of have everything in between. You have big stretches of very young forest that's regrowing after a lot of this area was used for cattle ranching at one point. And then you have the disturbance from the flooding. So you have kind of that gradient of disturbance and how long ago a disturbance happened. Then also that flooding gradient is important. So different areas in the forest flood with different frequency. They stay inundated at different times. And that drives a lot of the plant communities as well. So you have those two things working together to kind of make a really diverse set of habitats where you can walk through the forest and see like the tree community change with just a change of a couple inches in elevation difference that makes the ground you're walking on wet, where you're walking in a few inches of water where you weren't before. Then the vegetation community will turn over with that. Or you'll walk past a location where you can guess there was once a fence where the forest age seems to be cut in half from a relatively old forest to a very young one. The main thing that attracted me to the Great Trinity Forest was the diverse wildlife community. So in the past, it's been really difficult for scientists to answer questions about how urbanization impacts these sensitive species that we want to conserve. Because in many cases, as I said before, if you have a piece of habitat surrounded by urban areas, those species just aren't there. So all we could really say is these species don't occur in forests that have an urban matrix. Great Trinity Forest is relatively unique in this way, in that you can look at all of these impacts from the surrounding matrix that are hypothesized to displace these species you want to conserve. Things like noise from traffic, light pollution, invasive species. And right next to that, in the Great Trinity Forest, unlike a lot of these other places, there's basically a complete wildlife community that would be expected in this type of habitat. And it's a similar wildlife community that you would find further into East Texas, into Louisiana, and the Southeast United States in these bottomland hardwood forests. The Great Trinity Forest and a couple places out by the Fort Worth Nature Center are some of the most western extents of this type of habitat. But here you can look at prothonotary warblers and you can look at their distribution within the forest and compare it to a lot of these urban impacts from the matrix, if you can find a way to map them. Prothonotary warblers are very strict habitat specialists. They only live in bottomland hardwood forests. You can look at swamp rabbits, what areas of the forest they're using. That's who's on the bottom left. So that was kind of my original idea or baseline for what I wanted to do in the Great Trinity Forest. So my research ended up breaking down into kind of three different chapters. These kind of became three different publications in scientific journals. That's kind of how I organized my work. So the first two chapters look at swamp rabbits. When I initially got out to the Great Trinity Forest, I knew I wanted to work with birds. So birds had been kind of my inroad into first being a naturalist and then later being a scientist. My grandfather was a huge bird watcher, traveled all over the place. I was the grandkid who was smart enough to think that bird watching was cool. And when my grandmother got tired of going to far-flung locations and getting bit by mosquitoes, I was there to jump in. So I got to do some really cool birding trips when I was young, and I kind of got the bug and got really interested. Then when I got to college, I had some professors who told me that all that knowledge of birds was actually really important and really valuable, as opposed to my mom, who would make fun of me for just having all this bird information stuffed in my head that was keeping other things from being in there. So I initially went out to these locations and I knew I was going to do something with the bird community. But one of the things I noticed that you can see in the second picture there are all these piles of pellets basically on top of logs. That was my entrance into looking into swamp rabbits. So chapter one of my dissertation looked at the impacts of urbanization on the distribution of swamp rabbits. So swamp rabbits are a good example of a habitat specialist. So the big picture question I'm asking here is, how do factors associated with the urban matrix impact the distribution of the swamp rabbit in the Great Trinity Forest? So again, we have all these different hypothesized impacts from the surrounding matrix that people have thought about, that there is like a biologically plausible way that they might be displacing wildlife from all these other urban habitat fragments that are smaller than the Great Trinity Forest, and keeping these species from using them. So it was really interesting to think about beforehand kind of our expectations for what we would find. Would swamp rabbits like only occupy those core center areas far away from the road or the urban matrix, or would they be more distributed throughout the forest? And then which of these specific impacts might be driving their distribution? So if they're not distributing the forest evenly, if they're occupying certain areas more than others, are any of these things specifically driving it? And if we can answer some of those questions, maybe we can come up with some conservation answers. Maybe you could build more sound barriers around roads if noise pollution was driving changes in their distribution. So swamp rabbits are habitat specialists. They are endemic to the Southeast United States. On the bottom right, you can see kind of the initial thing that sparked my interest when I was hiking around out in the forest, trying to come up with what my study was going to be in a more specific way and just kind of exploring the area. I kept seeing these downed trees lying on the ground that had piles of animal poop on them. And a little research told me that those were latrines of swamp rabbits. So latrines are just places where an animal repeatedly defecates. They're thought to be a signal, like an olfactory signal, or a territorial signal between individuals. More than one individual will use these latrines. And if these latrines didn't exist, I really wouldn't have had an inroad to studying swamp rabbits. So that picture on the left is a picture I took of a swamp rabbit. In the roughly 5 years that I was out in the forest all the time, I think I saw 3 or 4 swamp rabbits ever. They're super secretive, they're super good at hiding. And even though there's evidence that there's quite a few individuals in the forest, they're really, really hard to see. And when you see them, they end up shooting out from like a pile of brush that you're walking into, and they won't move until they're basically right under your foot. They don't have burrows, so they have to be good at hiding and holding still. Obviously, the habitat they occupy is too wet for burrowing, which is what a lot of other rabbits do to survive. So these latrines kind of mark the areas of the forest that they're using. So I had 3 consecutive winters where my goal was to just go out into the forest and find as many swamp rabbit latrines as I could. Every time I found a latrine, I made a GPS point marking that location, took some information about the latrine. During those dedicated searches in the winter, we searched the entire forest. So we wanted to make sure that we spent at least some time every one of those winters looking in all the different areas, that we didn't leave any place unsearched. We searched in the winter because that's when it's easiest to see the latrines. So it's like when the conditions are leaf off, it's easier to see through the understory and all the shrubs and actually locate the latrines. I also just did opportunistic searching. So anytime I was out working on other pieces of my study, I was working on a bird survey and I stumbled across a swamp rabbit latrine, I would stop and I would take a GPS point at that location as well. Now, a lot of this searching wasn't done systematically. So when I talk about my bird surveys, you actually go out and survey plots. So then you have information on whether a bird was present or absent in that plot. This searching was more freeform, more opportunistic. And that was because these searches were really focused on gathering pellets as a source of genetic information. So that's going to be chapter 2 of the dissertation that I'll get to. But because that was our goal here, we didn't have a structured searching method. So these are the locations of the 650 different latrines that I recorded over roughly a 4-year period out in the forest. One of the things you notice right away is that these latrines are not equally distributed throughout the forest. They're concentrated in specific areas. So hopefully we'll be able to find some answers why they're concentrated in some areas more so than others. You can see these areas up here north of I-75 that have no swamp rabbit latrines in them. We searched those areas really extensively, and we really wanted to make sure, and there's pretty big parts of the forest where there's not evidence of swamp rabbits in those areas. So we wanted to come up with a general modeling framework. So we're going to go into some math here, kind of looking at what are all the different possible things that could be driving the swamp rabbit distribution. I have those anthropogenic variables that we already mentioned before that I was interested in, but we also have to account for environmental variables. So swamp rabbits they're not distributed equally throughout their habitat, even in non-urban places. There's things to do with the vegetation structure, the vegetation composition, where they prefer certain types of habitats over others. So we have to account for all that too, as well. So first, I want to talk about kind of these anthropogenic variables associated with the urban matrix and kind of how I generated them and created this modeling framework. So I looked at 2 different types of noise, intermittent and continuous noise. So there's some publicly available noise mapping that's produced by the Department of Transportation that looks at traffic noise and air traffic noise. I separated these 2 different types of noise out because there's a lot of research showing that they impact species in different ways. So continuous noise from a highway like I-20 that cuts through the southern part of the Great Trinity Forest, it's constant traffic. It's just this big, loud, humming background noise. That's very different than being in a quiet forest and having a plane fly overhead. If you've been in the Great Trinity Forest, maybe near the Big Spring area. That's right in the flight path of Love Field flights from Dallas to Houston. And there are really, really loud, relatively low planes coming over that area. So you have a situation where it's quiet and it's very loud. This is also the case with some of the commuter trains that cut along the edge or through the forest. So I kind of separated noise out into two different areas, and I kind of had a map showing which areas of the forest were noisy and to what degree. Another thing I did is I looked at impervious surface. So again, working in some of these spatial mapping programs like ArcGIS, at any specific location in the forest, I could make buffers and calculate how much impervious surface was nearby. And that kind of looks at two things. It looks at if you're at the center or the edge of the forest, and it's also looking at how intense the urbanization is at that edge, if you are at the edge. I also looked at feral hog distributions. So feral hogs are an invasive species, and they are really abundant in the Great Trinity Forest. I think every time I went out in the field, when I got off the trail, just hiking around in the backwoods locations, I saw hogs most days, and sometimes I saw herds of hundreds and hundreds of hogs, of uncountable numbers going by. So there's a lot of them out there. There's a very plausible direct mechanism where you could understand how they would change what areas that rabbits would use. In areas where the hogs are very common, like under masting trees where there's lots of activity, they literally just root up and tear up the ground. It looks like a bulldozer's gone through, and a lot of them have been through an area. So that obviously is destroying habitat for these rabbits. And there's also research showing that feral hogs actually will predate small mammals as well. And then we have Chinese privet, another invasive species I mapped. It's associated with urbanization. It's one of the most common invasive shrubs in the Southeast United States. And it makes really, really dense stands of shrubs and stems. They're actually super hard to move through. They're out on the Buckeye Trail. If you've been in that area, you've seen these really dense stands of shrubs. Those are invasive species. Those are Chinese privet. And they kind of have an unknown impact at this point on swamp rabbits. They are invasive, but they also create a lot of structure and cover in the understory. And one of the things swamp rabbits want in their habitat is significant cover in the understory. So those are kind of the 5 anthropogenic variables that I included in this mathematical framework that I'll describe a little bit later. I also included 5 environmental variables. So I looked at the vegetation composition and structure. So the vegetation composition was based on canopy tree communities. So in the Great Trinity Forest, there's areas where, for example, green ash are the dominant tree, and this is in the wetter areas. In some of the drier areas, there's areas called quote unquote levee forest right next to the river, where there's actually a lip where a higher elevation area is right next to the river. And this is where you get your masting trees, your bur oaks, your pecans. So one of the things I was able to do is I was able to purchase a drone with some leftover money we had. I flew it all over the forest and took pictures of the forest canopy from relatively low. And then by looking at those pictures and ground truthing things, I basically learned to identify all the different tree species in the forest from pictures of the canopy. And learning that, there was a little bit of a learning curve, but I was able to literally go and stand where these different trees were if I got confused about what something was. And I kind of learned to figure all that out. And then I used which trees were kind of dominating different areas and created a number of different habitat types. I also looked at the structure of the vegetation. So there's a lot of research showing that the structure is important regardless of the species. To do that, I used LIDAR data that was flown by Tarrant County. So LIDAR is basically, you fly a plane over an area and you have a really expensive imaging sensor that fires lasers down at the ground. And those lasers bounce back to the receiver. And the receiver basically looks at how long it took those lasers to hit, and it can recreate structures. Those lasers will basically bounce back off vegetation, and you can create like a 3D image of the structure of the vegetation, the shape of the canopy. So when you do this and you have this information about the vegetation structure, then you can then look for things that other research has shown swamp rabbits care about. So if you have a very uniform canopy that's not letting any light in, and the understory is very sparse. There's some areas in the Great Trinity Forest where you can see really far in the forest understory, where it's easy to walk. You can walk in a straight line because all that's in the understory is grass because the canopy is uniform and tall. Swamp rabbits don't like that. So again, they don't have the ability to burrow here. and they need to be able to escape or hide from predators. Lots of predators in the Great Trinity Forest: hawks, owls, coyotes, bobcats. The type of habitat that they prefer is areas with more gaps in the canopy, where there's big shrubs in the understory they can use for cover. So they like what's known as a more heterogeneously structured forest. It's unevenly structured. So there's more light penetrating down into the understory. There's more structure in the understory. Topographic wetness index was another thing I looked at. It was basically a way that you could generate a map of flooding frequency or water holding capacity for different areas, because swamp rabbits are known to respond to wetter parts of the forest. Another thing I looked at was access to high elevation areas. So swamp rabbits live in a bottomland hardwood forest, and sometimes that forest floods. So this picture is of the lower chain of wetlands during a big flooding event. When I was there, when these events happen, swamp rabbits need somewhere to go to survive these events. There's research in the past showing that's important. That was especially important here in the Great Trinity Forest, because a lot of these areas that would be upland habitats are developed and urbanized. So the thought was there might be parts of the forest where the swamp rabbits have difficulty surviving flooding events because they don't have anywhere to go that is habitat. And then I looked at the width of the forest in different places. Some areas of the forest up near the city center are very narrow, where other places are very wide. So there's a modeling framework called Maxent. And in the simplest way I can explain it, it takes information from all the locations where I found swamp rabbit latrines, and it looks at those 10 variables that I'm giving information to about the model. So every one of these little grid squares, I basically divided the Great Trinity Forest up into 3,000 grid cells. Every one of these cells has information about how loud it is there. What are the abundance of feral hogs there? What is the structure of the forest there? All 5 of those variables are information for both the anthropogenic and the environmental variables in every one of these grid squares. And the model basically looks at what are the patterns we see in these grid squares where we have swamp rabbit latrines, and basically tries to tease apart these different variables and see which ones are the most important in terms of which ones are driving the distribution. And once you find that out, you can also get information about how they're driving the distribution. So we know, for instance, that vegetation composition is important, and then we can look at, well, which types of habitat they actually prefer. So what this method does is it models probability of presence. It takes information from those swamp rabbit locations, and then it can actually extrapolate that and make predictions about where swamp rabbits are likely to be. So this map, in a lot of ways, that was generated overlays pretty well with the places where there are actually swamp rabbits. One of the interesting things we see, though, is there's actually areas of high probability of presence here where we didn't find swamp rabbits. That'll help lead us into chapter 2, wondering why some of those things might have existed. The model validated itself successfully. Basically, what it would do is it ran itself thousands and thousands of times, and every time it would leave out a random group of 20 to 40 grid cells and see how well it could predict their location, what the model was building through probability of presence. So basically, the model was good at predicting where latrines were in the forest. You can see probability of presence was not distributed evenly. There are some areas that represent good habitat for swamp rabbits and some that represent bad. So now we want to know which variables was driving this variation, right? What variables make a grid square good or bad habitat for a swamp rabbit? So these are 2 different metrics that I use to kind of measure that idea of which of these variables is driving that variation in probability of presence. And there were 4 that were the most important: vegetation composition, structure, and topographic wetness, and then feral hog activity. So one of the things you'll notice is the anthropogenic variables on the right. A lot of them had a very small contribution to the model. The different types of noise, how intense the urbanization was nearby really wasn't impacting what parts of the forest swamp rabbits would use. They were impacted more by some of these, again, environmental variables, these naturally occurring variation in their habitat, and also by feral hogs. So now we can look a little closer at these four variables, and we can try to understand in what ways they were impacting swamp rabbits. So vegetation composition, they preferred certain types of forests. The two forest types they preferred were areas that were dominated by cedar elms or older forests. So these are areas that have a relatively complex understory. They have some shrubs, but they also have older trees. So these were the areas that they preferred to occupy versus early successional habitats, for example. So this was kind of expected. Vegetation structure was expected as well. So what you can see here is this peak in this kind of middle area of vegetation structure. So on the left side of the x-axis, you basically have the representation of LiDAR having very few returns up high. So that would represent like open grassland areas. And then if you move far to the right on the x-axis, you basically have a representation of all the LiDAR returns are from the canopy, where you have a uniform canopy and not much structure in the understory. So they prefer somewhere those areas in the middle, where you have lots of structure up high and down low. So this again agreed with our expectations. Flooding frequency, we found an interesting thing with a middle peak. We were kind of expecting them to prefer wetter areas. We had some hypotheses that because there was a lack of highland areas for them to move to during flooding events, that survival might be lower in those wettest areas. And even though they preferred those, they might not be able to survive there. Other research shows they prefer the wettest areas of the forest. They kind of had this peak in these areas of middle wetness. And the other thing we saw was these patterns of feral hog activity. So the first thing to notice is that over here when feral hog activity was high, and we just measured this by being out in the forest and taking notes about how much damage and hog sign there was. In the areas where hog activity was high, we didn't find any swamp rabbit latrines. In areas with lots of tracks and areas with lots of scat that have been dug up, swamp rabbits wouldn't use those areas. They used basically areas of low and moderate feral hog activity. One of the other things you'll notice is they also did not use areas where feral hogs were absent. Feral hogs were kind of only absent in that one area of the forest up near I-75, that big area that didn't have swamp rabbits as well. And my hypothesis for that is that basically there was some underlying variable that we didn't collect that both are responding to. So that area of the forest was all young green ash forest. There wasn't a lot of structure in the understory. There's also no food there for the hogs. There's no masting trees. So that was my kind of hypothesis for that part of the result. So the big picture conclusions of the first chapter is the urban matrix might not make habitat fragments unsuitable for sensitive species. We saw the rabbits not responding to things like noise or urbanization intensity. And then large, well-connected fragments could be important habitat for these species. Control of feral hogs is a really important conservation issue for a variety of small mammals and reptile species in the United States. They destroy habitat, they predate animals. Our research supports that as well. So this leads us to chapter 2, looking at the population genetics of swamp rabbits in the Great Trinity Forest. The hypothesis here is that maybe we can find evidence that roads or the urban matrix are actually stopping the swamp rabbits from moving around in the forest. And that would be evidence that maybe the urban matrix isn't changing the quality of the habitat in the forest. It's just that species can't move through it to colonize or move around and repopulate certain areas. So there's kind of 3 steps to this part of my research. I collected non-invasive genetic data from latrines. I'd go around latrines, I'd try to find fresh pellets, and I'd put them in a preservative. You had to find fresh ones because the actual DNA of the swamp rabbit is just on the outside of the pellet. If it sits out in that sun, the DNA is degraded. So you have to hunt around looking for fresh ones that were laid hopefully in the same day. I then use microsatellite loci to basically identify individuals. There's certain locations on the genome where once they're mapped, you can look, and if you have enough of them, you can find out not only which genetic samples represent different individuals, but how related those individuals are to one another. And then once you have a bunch of samples and locations for those samples in the forest and how related they are, you can use landscape genetics to look and see if roads are causing rabbits, for example, to be less related than expected on opposite sides. So these were all the latrine locations that I found. I would repeatedly go out to these and search them over and over and try to find fresh pellets and collect those and preserve them. There's then a DNA extraction process. I did a ton of lab work where that DNA is purified, and then it can be amplified through PCR and other means. We got 7 locations on the swamp rabbit genome that we could use to identify individuals. So what you see in this picture on the right is one loci for 3 different individuals. And you can see that they have some differences and some similarities. So the bottom 2 individuals share this one loci that their DNA is amplified at. So you can use those commonalities to see how related 2 individuals are to one another. And then you can also, if we had the same individual, they would have the same pattern at all of these loci. And we had to use genetic work from other closely related rabbits to find these loci because a lot of genetic work hadn't been done with swamp rabbits yet. So then we can use these landscape genetic approaches to answer questions like, are these little subpopulations in the Great Trinity Forest where we saw there's kind of clusters of areas where swamp rabbits are they genetically different from one another, or is it all ubiquitous and they're all moving together? And then if there are differences in the population, we can try to locate specific things in the environment, like roads, for example, that are impacting dispersal. So what were our results after all that lab work, all those collections? We collected 367 samples. We genotyped 234 of them. Some of those samples, the DNA was too degraded. We found that 80 different unique individuals made all those samples. So we have rabbits obviously using multiple latrines that we're collecting from the same rabbit multiple times. We made a closure collection where we collected basically from all the latrines in a short amount of time, hopefully short enough that new individuals weren't leaving or entering the population. And it found that there were 42 unique individuals there. Based on that, the estimated population size for the Great Trinity Forest was roughly 63 swamp rabbits. 95% confidence intervals for that are somewhere between 45 and 77 rabbits. So the yellow dots here represent the unique individuals, kind of the center point if they had more than one collection location. So we kind of divided these up into different clusters. We then used a metric called FST, which just looks if 2 groups are different or the same genetically, and compared these different clusters. And one of the things we found, even though these clusters are close together in relation to like how far apart in most rabbit populations you have to be before they're genetically different, we found that they were significantly different for all the clusters except B and C, which you can see are relatively close together and connected to a big piece of habitat. The dog alarm's going off. But if you look at C to D, for example, or C to E, you can basically see that those are genetically different populations. When you look at genetic spatial autocorrelation, you can see similar things. This basically just says that individuals that are close together are more related than expected, and individuals that are far apart are less related than expected. So this is how related are individuals based on how far apart they are, like what are our expectations. So we were able to do some mapping. So this is resistance to dispersal mapping, divided the forest up into 200 different grid cells. And it could basically, by mapping the spatial relationships with line segments between all these individuals, it could say what parts of the forest represented areas that were inhibiting or facilitating dispersal. The take home here is those red areas that are inhibiting dispersal. A lot of those are in the urban matrix. So another thing we can link these genetic differences to across these small areas is not just the urban matrix, but it's also roads. So we can see individuals that were on the opposite sides of large roads were less related than expected. So if you look at individuals in clusters A and B, they're separated by I-75, lots of traffic there. They are less related than expected based on how far apart they are. If you look at individuals E and F, they're very close together. Individuals from those clusters, they're much less related than expected on opposite sides of I-20. Again, they're very close to each other, but they're not as related as they should be. So it's difficult for rabbits to cross these highways. So the conclusion from chapter 2 is there's significant genetic differentiation within this single population. The amount of genetic differentiation we saw here was equivalent to what you see in other species of rabbits that are miles and miles apart in different habitat fragments. And then we were able to link that genetic differentiation to the urban matrix and highways. All right, move pretty fast here to get through chapter 3, looking at birds. So I have a similar approach here to I had for chapter 1, but here we're looking at the bird community. So how does urbanization impact the distribution of urban avoiding breeding songbirds in the Great Trinity Forest? So I went out and I looked and surveyed birds in the Great Trinity Forest. The Great Trinity Forest had a lot of urban avoiding species. You can see some of those here. Northern Parula, prothonotary warbler, vireos, painted bunting, et cetera, et cetera. So I went out into the forest in 3 different summers. I would search early in the mornings and I would identify all the birds in these 5-hectare plots by their vocalizations. I had a recorder with me in case I was confused by something, I could go back and review it. These plots, these 5-hectare plots are randomly placed at different areas in the forest. And then basically afterwards, I've got that same suite of environmental variables, and I'm hoping that those environmental and anthropogenic variables can explain why certain plots are or are not occupied by those birds of interest. So again, we have a similar modeling framework. We also have variables here that tell us how easy or hard it is to detect individuals. So one of the things we're worried about is we have variables like anthropogenic noise from highways. They could plausibly displace birds. Birds might not want to be near highways. But the other thing it does is it actually makes it more difficult to hear birds as well. So this modeling framework basically can tell me that if I'm finding less birds near the highways, is it because they're just harder to hear or there's actually less of them? And it basically does that by this other variable I would record the first time it detected each individual bird. So I had those same 5 anthropogenic variables that I had when looking at swamp rabbit distributions. And then I had a very similar suite of environmental variables that I used to model what areas these different urban avoiding birds were and were not using. I also had a variety of detection variables, so things that might impact my ability to detect these birds. So time of day is important. As we get later in the morning, the birds sing less. It's harder for me to find them. The day of the season is important too. As we got later into the summer, the birds sing less often once they're out of territory establishment and moving into nesting. The vegetation structure is also important. It's easier to see and hear birds in open habitat. And then background noise. So I was actually measuring noise levels when I was out in the forest. So that not only accounts for things like traffic noise, but natural noises that could inhibit my ability to hear, like cicadas. So I searched 400 plots. I recorded 50 different species. 26 of those were urban avoiders. I had large enough sample sizes to make models for 17 different species. So I needed a certain number of those 400 plots to be occupied for the math to work. So I was able to model a group of urban adapted species. So these are the species that I had large enough sample size for that represent species that can adapt to urban environments. I then had a group of species that were urban avoiders. So I had actually an equal number of urban avoiding and urban adapting species that I had good sample sizes of. So we have healthy populations of these urban avoiding species that you can see listed here. So the easiest way to explain this next set of graphs is the response of the whole bird community to these different variables. So this first variable is urbanization intensity. It's how much impervious surface is near a plot. Now you can see each one of these symbols is a different bird. And if this symbol is below 0, that means that the birds are responding negatively to this variable. So as urbanization intensity increases, the chance of a plot being occupied decreases if the bird's below that line. So you can see all the birds on the left here below the line are those urban avoiders, the painted bunting, the prothonotary warbler, the white-eyed vireo. We have some species that are not reacting to urbanization intensity. Their symbols are white. Species that are black. So you can also see we have a few species that are responding positively to urbanization intensity. One of the things to notice on this first graph is just how many individual species we have moving away from that central axis. So when we move to some of these other variables like continuous noise, the first thing you'll notice here is we have a lot more white symbols than black symbols. There's fewer species reacting to continuous noise. So this is traffic noise. The species that are reacting negatively are yellow-billed cuckoo and red-bellied woodpecker. There was previous research showing that species with lower vocal frequencies had difficulty communicating when there was background urban noise. And yellow-billed cuckoos and red-bellied woodpeckers have that lower vocal frequency. So that's the same frequency that the background noise is at. Some of these other birds, even urban avoiders, weren't impacted by how loud certain areas of the forest were, because they have a higher pitched call that can cut through and they can still communicate. If we looked at intermittent noise from airplanes and from trains, you can see more species are negatively affected here. And again, intermittent noise has a different mechanism by which it works. In birds, continuous noise masks communication. Intermittent noise may be inducing a fear response. So you can see over here on the left, we have a lot of those urban avoiding species again. Then we can look at feral hog activity. We have an interesting scenario here where we actually have some species responding positively and negatively. There's interesting hypotheses for species responding positively. There's in other areas of the world where feral hogs are native in Europe and Asia, there's actually birds that follow hogs because when they root through the ground, they actually create feeding opportunities. You could also see why lots of loud, disruptive hogs could displace other birds. So this is kind of an interesting starting point maybe for future research on why some species respond in different ways to feral hogs. And then Chinese privet, the birds really didn't react to it one way or another. You can see that even the darkened symbols here are still very close to that initial slope of occupancy. So they're not reacting to it in a very large way. So conclusions for the bird part of the study, the strongest response was to urbanization intensity. So just how dense was the urbanization that was nearby as opposed to noise or some of these other things. All 5 of the variables significantly impacted more than one species. 2 species were not impacted by any anthropogenic variables. There's kind of some more openings into future research. There's not a lot of research on that idea of fear-based displacement from intermittent noise or feral hog activity. So again, this kind of gets at the idea that only the largest urban forests might be good habitat for these urban avoiding species. So even if we went in and we made a big effort to remove invasive species from urban habitats and build sound walls around roads, a lot of these species are just not going to use areas that are near a dense urban matrix. That's kind of the take-home message for a lot of this research. So big picture, conclusion all the way around, the response of urbanization is mediated by species traits. Large habitat fragments are required for urban avoiding species to persist there. The shape of habitat is important. A lot of times when you have riparian fragments, the fragment is never very wide. So there's never an area where the bird or the swamp rabbit can be far away from a dense urban matrix. If you have a more uniformly shaped piece of habitat as a larger center, where those species can be away from that area. Feral hogs, additional mitigation is needed. The city's actually trying to do trapping in the forest, but there's just way too few people trapping compared to how fast these hogs are reproducing. And then urban conservation requires careful planning and mitigation if you want to conserve these species we care about in these urban areas. All right. Number of acknowledgements. I want to thank all the people that were part of my committee to help me with this research. Ben Johnson, Ben Sandifer were people who helped me find good field locations and showed me around a little bit. I had a lot of other people that had helped as well. I forgot this picture was in here. This is a picture of me. It's kind of a field selfie of me stuck in quicksand. Quicksand is real. I thought it was just in Johnny Quest cartoons when I was a kid and I'd never see any, but I actually got stuck in quicksand. And you can see all the gear hanging off me there as well, how ridiculous I looked. Another funny picture. Sometimes I'd get picked up and dropped off on the side of the road right next to the sign that said, "Don't pick up hitchhikers off of I-20. All right. I'll be happy to answer any questions. So I got a few minutes left and I'm I'm happy to stay a little while longer if anyone wants to ask more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. If anyone does have any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. I found it interesting that there's so many different varieties of swamp rabbits.
Yes, they were genetically diverse in the area. And again, we kind of link that to the idea that there's lots of highways that are bisecting the forest, kind of breaking these up into these little fragmented subpopulations where you have these clusters where you have certain parts of the forest where you'll find lots and lots of latrines. And then you have parts of the forest where you won't find any.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. Does the Forest Park area of Fort Worth compare in any way to the GTF?
So the Forest Park area of Fort Worth, big picture, the Great Trinity Forest is so much larger than any of the other urban forest fragments. Like the other biggest ones that you can kind of see when you look on a map is some of the fragments of habitat in North Arlington along the Trinity River. But the Great Trinity Forest is by far the biggest and the most continuous. So it's unbroken, one big chunk. And it's really just on a different scale than anything else. And honestly, there's very few things in the United States that are even similar to it. And as I said before, it's actually the biggest.
Do you think the Fort Worth area at one time, ages ago, was ever anything like the Great Trinity Forest?
Yes, so you have similar habitat out by the nature center where you have bottomland hardwood forest there. So all along the Trinity River where there were floodplains, I think this bottomland hardwood forest is pretty widely distributed in these lower lying areas.
Fort Worth is so unique to me. That's where I'm from. And in the Forest Park area, you have these beautiful, what used to be forest areas, and you go 15, 20 minutes to the west, and it's a different world.
Yep.
Yeah, it's desert almost. It's scrub brush. It's everything but a forest.
Yeah, this whole area is a very unique biome in terms of like it's the prairies and cross timbers region. So you have forested areas and relatively dry limestone prairies right next to each other.
Does the forest play any role in migration? And if that's true, is it being impacted negatively?
I didn't explore that area of research, but the forest definitely plays a really important role in migration for a number of species. Birds in general are more behaviorally plastic. They're more tolerant during migration than they are setting up their breeding territories. And you'll have observed this if you've looked at birds during migration. You can see really kind of rare things or things you would associate with natural areas in your backyard sometimes. So they just need somewhere as they're moving through. But for example, the Great Trinity Forest I know is a really important area for post-breeding dispersal for wood storks in particular years. So wood storks come up from the Gulf of Mexico in the fall and late summer after breeding, and they will feed in the Great Trinity Forest. And depending on the year, you can have hundreds and hundreds of wood storks falling out of the sky right in front of you, landing on the wetlands there if there's been flooding.
We have one more question in the chat from Lori. Did you do any documentation of migrating northern nesting birds passing through? That is, did they seem to try to avoid the area and press on to more rural habitats?
So I did not look at migrants. I just looked at the breeding birds, but my suspicion and what other research would say is I actually think the Great Trinity Forest is probably like a funnel or a conduit that all the birds are attracted to. So imagine you're a bird migrating and you hit the DFW Metroplex. The Great Trinity Forest is going to be kind of the best looking place thereabouts for you to rest, to refuel. It's the most natural habitat you have if your migration path kind of took you towards DFW, this huge sprawling metropolitan area. So I actually think that the forest is probably a haven or a sanctuary for a lot of these species. And like we saw, there was lots of urban avoiding birds that actually made their breeding territories in the forest. The populations appear to be relatively healthy. And there's a lot of research that shows that the breeding season is the season that birds are most vulnerable to some type of anthropogenic disturbance. They're the most picky when they're picking their nesting areas. as opposed to migrating or wintering. So I think the forest is a really important habitat for a lot of species. And even though it's an urban forest, again, it's so large that there's lots of areas that are not impacted by the urban matrix.
Thank you, Doctor. Is there any more questions that we have? And is there any contact information, or if anyone asks, would you want me to give out, I guess, your email address, or do you have a website, anything like that?
No, that'd be great. I'd be more than happy to talk to anyone else who has some more questions or who's interested about anything in the Great Trinity Forest. I'd also like to have more opportunities, if anyone knows of any or if anyone's involved in other organizations, to present this research to some more local people. So I'd be more than happy for you to share my email with anyone who might be interested.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. I think we might even have you back in person sometime, because this was a great presentation.
No, that'd be fun. I'd like that.
All right, well, I'm going to stop the recording now.